we're at a historical low right now. Only 32% of Americans right now have any reasonable faith in the ability of the mainstream media to deliver news factually. Where this distrust lies, it comes from the fact that big mainstream media corporations, they're held to their own political agendas, very specific political agendas, and they pander to a very particular audience. You have organizations that skew very liberal, and then you have, the other half of the organization that skew very conservative, and you can almost tell what their perspectives are on certain topics before even reading the article. So a lot of this comes down to transparency. I think the beauty of the blockchain is everything is trustless. Having this sort of tokenized economy on DNN and having this mix of incentives and penalties for all the users participating on the network, I do feel that there could be a certain level of trust that gets attained.
Hi, I'm Todd. Welcome to the third DNN Town Hall. Today we'll be talking about technology and journalism. And today we're joined by, of course, again, DNN's co-founders, Samit, Singh and Dondrey Taylor. We're joined today by our special guest, Grant, and he is a tech journalist, and he has graciously joined us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to everybody. And to start off the conversation, I wanted to address how the introduction of social media has drastically changed how we consume and engage with the media landscape. So starting with you, Grant, and maybe add a brief introduction to answer this question, but how has technology changed news?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful question. Just as a quick background, I'm Grant Ferowich, Washington, D.C.-based journalist. I've covered topics on healthcare, technology, finance, politics, kind of you name it. Tech is sort of the latest thing I've become interested in. So I guess today, I think this is a really great question because we've become to see more and more that Facebook and Twitter are increasingly where people get most of their news. And while these are huge platforms with huge audiences and you can share content with people in your friend groups that might have similar interests, ultimately these aren't media companies and they don't have editorial standards. They don't really have an incentive to provide you with news that is the most topical news of the day, but more what is the most topical news of the day that you'll be interested in. And that's certainly important, right? Like to read the news that you're interested in. But when we have something where this is your main source of news, something like Facebook, and you're just getting fed content that you have like a predisposition or inclination to enjoy, we kind of get at the underlying factor of what Facebook is doing, and they're just trying to monopolize your attention. And similar with Twitter, like these guys, they make more money on ad revenues when people spend time on their site. So that's what they're in it for. They're not really in it for spreading good content. And they kind of are playing this double-edged sword where they get people to, they spread a lot of information, but then when they go to the government, they say, oh, we're a tech company. We're a tech company. We're not a media company. And so they can kind of get around having to follow actual editorial guidelines. And so that's been a pretty seismic shift in how we engage with news. So just a couple quick points. One, technology as a whole, I think it's really important to talk about the fact that, okay, how do we communicate and how can we look at Facebook and Twitter and Google in the context of a larger sphere? So we have something where, we've gone from word of mouth to written mouth to newspaper to telegraph to radio to phone to TV to internet, and then to Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, things like this. So with every new change, information moves at a much faster pace. And so that kind of brings me into my next point is about virality. A lot of things on the internet, it's about what's viral, right? Like what is the biggest thing of the day? And we actually have news companies that will report specifically on viral things. But if you're just going on to Facebook or Twitter, it's really easy to confuse what is viral with what's news. And I would say that our new platforms kind of tend to tilt towards providing things that are viral as opposed to new. And then just as a last point, there's so much information out there. So we have this phenomenon of information overload, and this very much coincides with the speed at which information is produced and reproduced. And that can make it sort of difficult to, have a solid idea on what do I need to know about what's going on in my country, my state, and the world. And those, I guess, are the biggest things that I've seen with how tech has impacted the news.
So I'd pose the same question to you, Samit, but maybe, tell me how you think technology has changed news. And for those that aren't aware of the mission of DNN, what is DNN trying to do to combat fake news?
So, I do want to point out a few things that Grant said. Yeah, I mean, technology has definitely made the dissemination of news overall much more efficient and faster, but it really has been it's been like a double-edged sword. There's been both, a lot of good aspects and a lot of bad aspects, especially when you look at, the way the media conglomerates are right now. Technology hasn't done much to change the current monopoly that we have in the media landscape, but at the same time, of course, it's made dissemination much quicker when it comes to more traditional means of delivering new content on a daily basis. But at the same time, now you have these gatekeepers like Facebook, like Twitter, and the majority of people in the U.S., for example, turn to Facebook for their daily news, and it's becoming a problem in the sense that I was reading some really interesting article about how Facebook's newsfeed, it shouldn't even be called newsfeed because it's not really news. You're looking at personal updates from friends and family and so on and so forth, and it's mixing with news articles at the same time, and it's like fully tailored for us. Hence, it turns into an echo chamber, and tech has created this phenomenon that Grant and I discussed too of these echo chambers, and it's not anything new, but it's become augmented at the point that these digital echo chambers have become impenetrable, and we're just living in this digital bubble that's created by these tech companies that are creating content specifically tailored to our own likes and dislikes. And I feel that technology ultimately it's made that phenomenon even bigger than it was in the past. So I'm both a pessimist and an optimist in many ways in terms of how it's affected news, and things do need to be better in that regard. And in terms of DNN, we want to essentially take the concept of transparency and bring it back into the news. And one of the things that we always talk about with blockchain is everything's visible. You can't hide actions on DNN behind any sort of political agenda. Everything's right out there in the open. So reader, you can see any type of revision that was made to an article, why it was made, and who earned the reward for said revision. So it's everything is really, really out there in terms of transaction history on the blockchain, and it's immutable, so it can't be altered or be tampered with.
So, Dondrey, I'm curious your perspective on how you think the phenomenon of instant gratification has played into the evolving media landscape that we see today.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to kind of what Grant was saying with the intention. So, I mean, now that we have such a variety of different publications out there, our attention to any particular one of those publications goes down. So I think that what we tend to do is we tend to gravitate towards those publications that put out more of what we like, but rather than what may be factual, or rather than even looking across all the publications and trying to get a broader perspective of what's going on. So I think that certainly plays a role in it and kind of ties into the whole social media aspect of it in the sense that, if you look at social media, it was kind of the first platform or first app that reached kind of a mass adoption, where now we have it on our phones, we have it on our desktops. So, because we have such easy access to social media, it kind of, hogs or kind of consumes all of our attention. And as a result, we go to it for pretty much everything, seeking that our friends may put out that we agree with. And
I just want to quickly add, there's no distinction between what's personal and what's newsworthy, especially when you look at Facebook. Like one of the biggest things that we all talk about is like maybe news, like actual news, should be separate from what you see on a daily basis on the newsfeed. Like the two don't really mix well.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like if you're something like Twitter or Facebook, you don't really care if they mix. It's just
yeah, exactly.
It's just content. But I think it's also, I wonder what you guys think about how it seems as though this instant gratification is not just something that is necessarily, like it seems like it's kind of rewiring how we think, right? So like now I see something, and if I see like a big story, I'm almost like kind of totally forgot what happened last week. Exactly. And it seems like we kind of have these like 2-week sort of intervals where cycles, like you go through a cycle and then every 2 weeks we kind of reset. So we'll talk about terrorism for a couple weeks. We'll talk about Trump's tax plan for a couple weeks. We'll talk about sexual misconduct in Washington and the media and Hollywood for 2 weeks. And then there's another new story that gets sensationalized. And now we're on to the next one. And we kind of forget about, okay, well, what were the cultural drivers of this previous news cycle, and what are the impacts of that actual news moving forward?
And I feel like it's made us more ambivalent to the actual facts. That's been like sort of like dangerous side effect.
Right, right.
Well, and we see it too. You know, when you have natural disasters, for example, you know, with Puerto Rico, that was big. That was quite a major headline for a couple of weeks, and now we don't hear much about it, even though the challenges and the issues that they're having are still there, and in fact, they're even worse now, right? Yep. Like the reports that we're hearing. And I guess I'm curious from all three of you, what role do you play? What role does media play in helping the consciousness of the public on these major issues? And you know, we've talked about how social media has changed that, but we turn to media for information. And you know, today, you know, even though there was this major attack in Egypt, the top story today across media, across the social media, is Black Friday. And as much as I'm all for a bit of sales and shopping, right? But what role, what role do you think the media plays in helping to address major issues of public consciousness, like Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I think what you have to do is sort of take topics and address them and address them for their own sake, as opposed to how popular they are. So if this is something that's important, if 80% of the people don't have power, if 40% of the people don't have power in Puerto Rico, if there's one contractor that's 2 people out of Montana that's responsible for doing all the repair work on Puerto Rico, we, like, as a public, we have to keep our government honest. And to do that, the media has to talk about it. So I would almost say that when we know something is very salient for the public to be thinking about, that I think a solid kind of reporting quality standards would say, well, you know, we're not just going to report about this because it's popular at the moment, but because there's still a bona fide public interest that is not being met, that should be met.
Well, and my question, I guess, to you, Samit, is what do you? I'm going to move on just quickly to a different topic, and I wonder, do you believe that technology can help the rise in fake news and alternative facts, and how does DNN help address that? Yeah.
So my answer to that question is yes, but it also depends. It's contingent on on the hands of the people that utilize that technology. I was reading some really interesting stuff last week about of course the rise of not only AI in the news, but how it can be used maliciously to create more and more fake news. It's getting crazy to the point that I forgot which university it was. I think it was somewhere in the West Coast, but a group of researchers at that university came up. They sort of built this algorithm that can generate ultra-realistic images on its own, and it was essentially generating pictures of actual people, but like not people that we've seen in pictures or anything, but it was like essentially creating fake images of actual human beings. And it's all being driven by machine learning, of course, and it's continuing to generate higher and higher quality images as people provided like the proper inputs. And now it's getting to the point that you can essentially recreate entirely fake images and attach them to articles and call it news. And AI is like, we talk a lot about AI essentially filtering out fake news and being able to detect, any factual inaccuracies. But the fact is, AI can be biased based on the inputs that you feed it. And it's just an example of, if it's concentrated in the hands of powerful corporations who use it for their own good, it's obviously going to be a bad thing. And technology can, essentially become the enemy of course, real news, especially when you have companies and malicious individuals utilizing AI to generate, things like fake images, fake audio, even for that matter. All possible. Right. Seeing like images of Obama and like actual audio being like essentially like it looks like he's like lip syncing it and actually speaking those words, and it's his voice, but it's not actually him saying any of those words. It's literally all being created by this. It's crazy, by an algorithm. So it goes both ways. I feel like technology, it just depends on who's using these tools and for what.
I'm curious from you, Grant. I mean, because you're a journalist and you're in this space. I know journalist friends of mine that say that, in journalism school, they were taught that they should have at least 5 sources to back up the facts in their story, whatever that story is, right? How do you find that process for you? Because, there's pressure to create new content on a regular basis from most news agencies, most news organizations. How do you balance that time to creating that new content that your editors are wanting while backing up your facts and your sources?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think that in theory, you want to have as many sources corroborate something as possible. And so even more importantly, most of my reporting, I've had usually 2 to 3 people, sometimes 1 or 2, that will edit my work before it is published live. So utilizing something like DNN, I see a ton of utility because I can have 7 people that are going to review this, and each one is going to have a different point of view. Each one is going to read differently. And what that does is they have an incentive to make sure what they're reviewing is legit as well. So when you have more eyes on it, it's like, okay, if even one thing looks like you might be fudging or engaging in hyperbole and stretching the truth a little bit, if you have 7 eyes on this, that's a lot more robust of a editing procedure than what most news organizations are doing right now. So that's something where I see, okay, like we can crowdsource sort of that editing process and crowdsource that publishing process. That's where I do see technology having a big benefit, especially when these reviewers are being compensated and sort of have skin in the game about what the final product looks like. But going back to, well, how can we judge our sources? It's really tricky because, so for example, we have about like 5 or 6 major news agencies that kind of run shop. And so when the Associated Press or Reuters puts out an article, this is going to be up in, especially if it's a big article, it'll be in every newspaper in America, and newspapers across the world. You see things like Agence France Presse, France's sort of news agency. They're really big as well. And so these guys are kind of, it's almost like when they report something, they might only have one source, but because they have so much recognition and legitimacy and backing that everybody reports it. And it's like, well, hey, Reuters reported it. They're pretty legit. So, but it's tough. I mean, especially when you think about, like, it does depend on like the level of stories that you're trying to do. So, a lot of military stories, for example, I mean, you might talk to one spokesman from the Pentagon, and like they'll tell you what they tell you, and ideally you say, okay, I know a former State Department official that I can talk to. I know someone who is a veteran that I can talk to, that they might not be able to verify the exact information, because some of the stuff it's classified. And that's really what's difficult for reporters, is wanting to tell the true story as much as possible, and then getting sort of firewalled and saying, oh, well, we can't tell you that, it's classified information. A lot of times this is a way to hide what's actually going on. And I think it's since the 70s, it's really kind of been a little bit overabused about what we say is classified and not classified. But so just to kind of draw back, is that it does make it a little bit more difficult to verify and corroborate the amount of sources you have. But when you can get many people looking at it, your odds of having good quality content go way up.
So I want to ask you, Dondrey, how you think DNN has the potential to help create credibility for the stories that are coming out through the writers of DNN, and because there's Grant touched on it, and the credibility piece, like AP, it all comes down to, in many ways, credibility. AP puts out a story, and as you said, Grant, people trust it because it's AP, and that really comes down to that credibility piece. So, back to you, Dondrey, on how you think DNN can help build that credibility for articles and news out there right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's all based on how we constructed the review process. So the whole review process, the foundation of it is reputation. So, all the players, from the writer, from the reviewer, even the reader for that matter, earn this reputation by vetting the article as closely for factual integrity as possible. However, I just want to make a point here. I think there's some confusion on behalf of the reader as to when something gets published, whether or not that is complete truth. So with DNN, we're not making the claim that everything that gets published is 100% truth. I think kind of what Grant left off on is that it's hard to verify if something is 100% truth. However, I think what needs to happen is there needs to be a process where if an inaccuracy is pointed out later, it can go back into this vetting process that involves the community and checking it again. So with DNN, that's our emphasis. I mean, we emphasize, going through as many reviews as possible, involving the writer, involving the reviewer, and involving the reader, and kind of collaborating to ensure that the pieces are as factual as possible. Another point too is, one of the highlights to our articles is, our main focus is to separate biases from the facts or what's being cited. I think if you look at a lot of articles from, like CNN or Fox, kind of like their opinion is intertwined in the article, and it almost becomes like an academic exercise to like point out, all right, this is what actually happened, this is what not. And like every piece of the article is like that. And, some people don't even read the article, like myself included, kind of, right? So we kind of look at the headlines. They're very sensationalized. They more or less kind of give us what we want to hear, and then we go our merry ways. So with DNN, we're kind of trying to take an approach. I like to, draw the similarity with Wikipedia, where when you go to a Wikipedia article, that article is going to be have various sections, right? So if you want to find out the history or maybe a summary of what happened, you go to the first section. If you want to find out, like if you're looking up a person, you want to find the personal life, you jump to the personal life. So that's kind of the approach we want to take with DNN, both from when it gets published, it's easier to consume for the reader. For the reviewer, it's easier to go to that section and know that this is the section that has, a lot of people have to kind of agree on those are what are facts, right? And then this is the opinion of the piece. And then from the writer's standpoint, clearly having that separation. So, that's kind of the focus with DNN.
So I wanted to address sort of a different element of this conversation. The current media landscape is divided essentially into three types of organizations: nonprofits, for-profit like network or cable news, and thirdly, government-sponsored. So like BBC, CBC in Canada, and so I'm curious, what incentives are in play in today's current news landscape? And I want to start with Grant on your perspective on this.
Yeah, sure. So again, going back to, I think the for-profit is sort of the most clear. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a business. So if I'm doing a revenue model and I'm doing news cycles, right, it's all about driving business. And that means driving viewerships. And as soon as one topic isn't driving views, boom, we got to switch. We got to get on to the next one, because if our numbers drop, our ad revenues drop, and that isn't in line with the bottom line. And so, I mean, at least it's transparent, right? We know what they're after. They're after a profit motive. So secondly, something like government-sponsored news is, it's been really interesting, right? So outlets such as the BBC and the CBC, they've done some tremendous reporting. Al Jazeera has done some tremendous reporting. And I think Al Jazeera is actually maybe the most interesting example, because this is a organization that's funded by the Qatari government. It's a very, very, very small country in the Middle East. It's very strategically located, and they're very close to large amounts of natural gas and oil. It's, I think, 2 million people or 200,000 people. It's very small, but it's the highest GDP per capita in the Middle East. You know, and you're talking about Saudi Arabia, you're talking about all these different places. And so there was Qatar and Saudi Arabia earlier in this year got in a diplomatic dispute. And so all of a sudden, Saudi Arabia's state news outlet, Al Arabiya, and Al Jazeera started really publishing these sort of hard-hitting reports on the other. When oil markets are good and when Qatar and Saudi Arabia are not in conflict with one another, they don't publish critical reports on one another. So we do see at the end of the day that even with a government-sponsored news outlet, is that it can become kind of an instrument of the state. And so while Al Jazeera often does great reporting, at the end of the day, you know, I don't think that they have a unique incentive towards truth, except as insofar as it helps their credibility, which is something. And I think Al Jazeera does a pretty good job, and some other state news outlets do as well. And so, but I guess it's like at best though, like, you know, the incentive isn't quality reporting per se, because it can still be distorted and used for other ends. And so lastly, going on nonprofits, oftentimes these are the outcome of a wealthy benefactor that maybe has 3 or 4 topics that they really want to see hard-hitting reporting on. And so if it's money and influence in politics, for example, and George Soros, if we just take an example, sponsors a media outlet, you know, that outlet probably wouldn't go too far into examining George Soros's activities in the political realm. So I think all of them have like their sort of unique incentive structures, but none of them is necessarily related to truth. And I think Dondrey made a great point that you can't really expect your news to give you the truth. I mean, you have to, I read news reports like a grain of salt, you know, take them with a grain of salt and see what you get. But, you know, it's also talking to people. It's also reading books. It's also reading history. It's also all these different things. So, but it does have a purpose, and I think it's important that we have as high integrity news as possible.
And so I'm curious to hear from you, Dondrey, on how you think how technology can alter impacts such as incentives. Like what role in media today does incentives play in pursuing that element of truth?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess if you just kind of look at like the evolution of how news gets their money, I mean, in the beginning it was through newspapers, through classified ads. They got money that way, and then kind of as technology progressed, then it led to ad revenue, and that's kind of where we are today, where you know, the ads kind of generate the revenue on behalf of what the content is about. So like in terms of incentives, I definitely think that it needs to change. So in terms of like, you look at Facebook, for example, you know, basically the people that put content on their platforms optimize that content to get the most viewership. So that whole process needs to change in the sense that with DNN, rather than look at the readership. So after the article's been published, that's when you want to maximize on the value of that article. We're trying to take a different approach and reward you prior to it being published based on how factual it is. And I think that's like really, really important. If you look at all the players trying to solve the issue of fake news, you look at Facebook, you look at all of them, none of them are going to, it would require that they change like the fundamental nature of their network to pull something like this off. Like they would have to completely remove ads entirely or find some other different way of getting revenue. Maybe it's through subscriptions, like Facebook's kind of trying to play around with that idea. However, then you run into the issue of like, how do we get people to pay? So, with DNN, and I think that's where we're kind of in a unique position, where we have this thing called crypto economics, where essentially you can construct the network in a way and back it based on this cryptocurrency and get people to behave and use the network in a way that you want them to. So with DNN, basically you structure the article as factual as possible, and how factual it is in the sense that, the consensus reached by the reviewers, that determines your payout, not when it gets published, although we do have a mechanism for that, and that's kind of like a secondary thing, but it's in the beginning, that process. So yeah, I mean, it's very important to kind of structure the incentives, and that's just something that I see that's lacking in a lot of platforms that we have kind of an advantage.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add, like, we basically, it's not like incentives are completely lacking in the media world. The problem is I feel that incentives aren't balanced. I mean, of course, there are economic incentives like everywhere. Of course, CNN, Fox, writers are getting paid, editors are getting paid. But the problem is there's no balance. Like the users, the average consumer should have some sort of a stake in the platform. I see that being one of the problems of Facebook as well. Like, if everyone has a stake, if incentives are balanced across the board, if even us as consumers are earning some type of reward for contributing to the network, we should get, we get something out of it. It makes a more level playing ground across the board. And I feel that's really important as far as DNN is concerned. We want to be able to correct the incentives and balance them for everyone. So, in that sense, everyone will sort of act for the good of the network.
Oh, there's also one point I wanted to add too, kind of going back to the classification of the news outlets. I would venture to say that a lot of readers actually don't know how a lot of these news organizations are getting their funding. So I'd be hard pressed to find people that understand that there was this, big donor that donated to this particular study, and that's why the study concluded the way it did. So I think with DNN, we also want to be very, very transparent in all of those, in the way it's getting funded, because there's no kind of outside party that's funding it. You kind of know how, money's going into that.
And being distributed according to each party. Yeah.
So I have two questions, actually, guys, from the audience. And the first one is for you, Grant. And that question is, should platforms like DNN be working with social networks rather than with media outlets to be more effective, to get people to venture out of their content bubble?
So, I mean, I think if we think about the overarching goal, which is getting people highest integrity and quality news content there is, I think there does need to be some cooperation and compatibility with existing social media platforms. I think it's something where I don't think the news wheel needs to be changed per se, but people would say don't reinvent the wheel, and then you have a big rock that's 20 feet in diameter that's all stone and that barely is a circle, and then you have a McLaren driving 700 miles an hour, and it's well, I don't know, maybe it's a pretty good idea to do a little bit of reinventing the wheel. So I think it's you got to tweak it a little bit. And I think that's sort of where that DNN, certainly I think it would be a great idea to work with existing social media platforms. But I also think that, you know, avenues where there already is sort of a bona fide established crypto communities, places like Steemit, I think are really interesting. But, you know, in places like Reddit, I think are really interesting. Stuff where there's like a really, you know, it's about the people. It's about the like sourcing things from the crowd and letting people from, you know, decide and say what they like and say, you know, this adheres to certain standards and it doesn't. But yeah, 100%, I think it's important to work with existing social media platforms. I guess working with traditional news, I mean, they'll see it as a competition, as it were. They'll see it as a new competitor. But I think that, you know, there's so much competition that, I mean, I think that like in terms of like people that follow the media, that it would be good for them to know. So you have like certain people that are like, they just report on the media. Eric Wemple at Washington Post. There's a couple of people at Politico, and they just report on the media. I think talking with them is certainly a great idea. If you go to USA Today, I mean, I would liken it to, you know, was USA Today reporting on Bitcoin in 2010?
Right, yeah.
And for you two, Dondrey and Samit, I was curious. We have someone asking, does DNN plan on implementing some kind of editorial decision-making process to ensure all important news are covered, rather than leaving it up to the writers completely?
Yeah, one of the things that we always talk about, like this is something Dondrey and I talk about all the time. It's funny, like it's really interesting because it involves, I guess, some aspect of governance, in the sense that you know, we have these editorial guidelines that we're starting off with right now, right? But you know, they're not perfect. There are some holes, there are some issues that we need to sort of like, you know, figure out and think through so we can implement a better version of these guidelines. But we don't want it to be solely concentrated in the hands of the founders. Essentially, we want everyone who's participating in the network to be able to like sort of like vote on amendments to the guidelines down the line, and like sort of just have this open dialogue and collaboration around what, how we can sort of create a better version of DNN, and in turn the editorial guidelines themselves, to ensure that you know, we don't just get the big issues covered, we also get the smaller issues covered. One of the things that's going to be, I guess, really interesting to look at is like having spin-offs of DNN. Like we always talk about the nodes, and people being able to host like geographical nodes, like in the region, and like their own version of DNN. Maybe those versions could sort of like cover news within that geographic area. That would be really, really interesting to see. Have like a DNN, let's say, you know, in the U.S. covering like, you know, solely like U.S.-based news, but also just anything concerning American affairs. But you could also have a DNN equivalent in, say, Japan, and it can cover like local Japanese news, and so on and so forth. I think that would be something that's really, really interesting. We hadn't really talked about it too much, but we've like explored the idea of like, we already you know, talk about nodes and publisher nodes and them getting rewarded for hosting nodes on DNN, but we haven't yet talked too much about like localization and smaller like you know, more local issues on DNN. But this could be like a really interesting way to go about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's like so many different use cases. I mean, you can also look at using DNN kind of like, we always talk about a transparent fact-checking service. Yeah. So if you look at like the players right now in fact-checking, it's these other organizations, some of which are non-profit, some of which are for profit. So you can kind of, if you think of DNN in the sense of not being just like the only place to publish it, but you maybe want to publish an article somewhere else, you can kind of have your article go through our vetting process and get almost like a stamp of like, this has been vetted by the community, and here's this long history, kind of like, you know, in the coding world, we have GitHub, and you can see all the different changes of people changing code. Using that and applying it to articles. So I mean, that's something that we've
And so I have one final question. This one from another audience member, and this is for DNN. This person's curious how many news categories will be covered and how each will be different.
So to start it off, we're going to start with pretty much news, just because we need to basically have a test case for DNN, and we feel that political news is the most.
Yeah, we've done like a lot of it is very polarized. We've done a lot of like early research, like market research, before we even started conceptualizing DNN, and a lot of like people's biggest pain point was in political news, because that's where you see a lot of like issues of fake news, as we call it, especially in the realm of politics and technology as well, for that matter. Especially when you look at like news in the crypto realm, the way the mainstream media covers it, it's really astonishing. So it's like, I'm thinking we could start off sort of like in the region of like the intersection of tech and politics, and sort of like, move from there. I do want us to sort of build up some authority in one niche first before expanding into other verticals, but I do want to keep incorporating more and more different avenues and different types of news, whether it's like longer term editorials or let's even say entertainment, so on and so forth, depending on where the demand is. And that's something we'll be testing a lot during DNN's beta. So I do encourage everyone who's getting involved in testing with us, see like what's like the best thing we can start with, and where can we move from there.
Yeah, and I
so
think, I was also like a big part of that too is that we want to branch off into a lot of different things. We also want to break the news as fast as we can, but I think one of the things that we were focusing on is ensuring that it is as factual as possible, and in the way people are using the platform can achieve that before we branch off into other things. So I think if we can achieve that with politics, then we can do that with anything, really.
And just to wrap up the conversation, because we've been chatting for about 40 minutes, and I know that all of us could chat about this topic for hours, I am sure. I'm certain of it. And I've been ending each one of these town halls with a really simple question, but I think it's, in our day and age and era, it's really important. And that is, finish the sentence for me, and this is for all three of you, starting with you, Grant, is journalism is important because?
Democracy is an experiment that could still fail, and without free press, you don't have a conduit for the people to pressure government, and you can slip into totalitarianism and tyranny very quickly.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think journalism is important because it pushes us to become investigators in our own right. Like it's sort of good journalism at least helps create like an open dialogue around issues, which as Grant said, that's like a cornerstone for a democratic society. You need to have an open dialogue about the issues that concern you, that matter to you the most. And free press it's the pipeline, the pathway to all of that.
Yeah, and in the way I see it as well is journalism is also asking those really tough questions, and holding people accountable. I think that's kind of like the mindset here. It's just like this collective way of reaching truth.
Yeah, it's very much like how the intellectual and professional class kind of talks to itself after you get out of college, right? Like how we talk about things is like, oh, well, what was in the newspapers? So it's like if we elevate that conversation, we elevate the collective conversation, which is
exactly.
And I know that there's a lot of exciting things ahead for DNN in the days and weeks ahead. And can you guys tell me how people keep in touch with you and how they watch for that in the coming weeks?
Yep. So one of our biggest places for conversation is our Slack channel, slack.dnn.media. And anyone who wants to essentially look through all our resources, we do have a lot of material on DNN. Our website's always like the best portal to all of that, dnn.media. And we're, of course, very active on Twitter. We field a lot of questions on Twitter. And our handle is DNN _ blockchain. So a lot of places to reach us, Telegram channel included.
And Grant, how do people check out your stories and the articles that you're writing if they want to follow what you're up to?
Sure, yeah. So there's muckrack.com, which is a really great place. If you type in Grant Ferowich, last name Ferowich, it has a great portfolio of all the work I've done. And then I've also started to assemble some of my stories at ferowichReport.com. So that's FEROWICH report.com. And you can find every way to get in contact with me on Ferowich Report as well.
And I just wanted to thank everybody who watched and who paid attention. And I really appreciate this conversation, and I'm sure that the conversation will only continue in the weeks ahead. And it is very much, all three of you are playing your role in helping to ensure that media in the years to come is filled with truth and good stories and accurate stories. So to everyone who watched, thank you, and we will be in touch with what's ahead for DNN and all the exciting things that DNN is up to. And again, thank you to all three of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.